Vesna Kolarov denied me in front of her whole pack on the coldest night of the year. She did it in 9 words, under the iron chandeliers of the long hall, with 400 people between the doors and the high table, and the snow coming down so hard against the windows that it sounded like something asking to be let in. Someone had asked her, lightly, pleasantly, the way you ask a question when you have already decided the answer is beneath you, who the woman with the ledger was. And Vesna Kolarov, who never once in her life raised her voice, who had been raised from birth to make a room go quiet by lowering hers, pressed her thumb to the old bite scar at the base of her own throat, which was the tell I had spent 4 years learning and had never told her I had learned. She keeps the ledger, she said. That is all she keeps. 400 people heard it. I heard it holding a book that weighed as much as a child. I want you to understand that I did not flinch, because I had spent 3 years teaching myself not to, and because there were 200 candles in that hall, and every one of them was reflected in the brass clasp of the ledger in my arms. And if my hands had shaken even slightly, every alpha in the room would have seen the light move. So I did not let the light move. I stood at the foot of the high table, in a borrowed gray dress with my mother's clasp under my thumb, and I said, "Alpha," and I inclined my head exactly as far as a records keeper inclines it, and I turned to go. And then the door at the kitchen end of the hall opened. Before I go on, if this story pulls you in, I keep the longer, more uncensored chapters of stories like this on my Patreon, GL After Hours. It's linked in the description and the comments for whenever you want to stay a little longer inside the story. Let me back up. My name is Sorcha Bell, and I was born into the Coldharbour pack the way a hinge is born into a door. Necessary, unremarked, and noticed only when something stops closing properly. My mother kept the ledger before me. Her mother kept it before her. It is not a job anyone competes for. The ledger is 1,100 pages of pack record bound in oxide and iron, and it holds every birth, every bonding, every land grant, every debt, every treaty, and every rescission of a treaty that Coldharbour has entered into since the winter of 1642, and it is written in 4 hands across 4 centuries, 3 of which are no longer taught. I can read all 4. There are, at the time this story takes place, 2 living people who can. My mother was one, until the winter she wasn't. That left me. I was 21 when Vesna Kolarov came home to take the pack. Her father had died badly and slowly over 11 months, and she had come back from the coast where she had been building something of her own, and she had put it down without a word about what it cost her, because that is what Kolarovs do. I remember the day she walked into the record room. I remember it because I had a smear of oak gall ink across my cheekbone and did not know it, and because she looked at me for slightly longer than the room required, and then said, "You have ink on your face," and left. She did not say it unkindly. She did not say it kindly, either. That was the first sentence Vesna Kolarov ever spoke to me, and I thought about it for approximately 4 years. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being an omega in a pack like Coldharbour. You are not mistreated. That is not the shape of it. You are simply arranged. There is a place you stand at a feast, and a place you stand at a funeral, and a distance you keep from an unbonded alpha, and none of it is written anywhere, and all of it is enforced perfectly by 400 people who would be genuinely offended if you suggested they were enforcing anything at all. I had a room off the record hall, I had a stipend, I had the ledger. And for 4 years, I had the particular exhausting privilege of being the person Vesna Kolarov talked to when she could not talk to anyone else. It started with treaty language, and it did not stay there. She would come at the end of the day when the hall had emptied and the fire in the record room had gone down to a red bed, and she would sit on the arm of the reading chair. Not in it, never in it, always on the arm, like someone who had not decided to stay. And she would ask me what the Eastern clause actually meant in the third hand. And I would tell her, and then neither of us would leave. We talked about her father. We talked about the coast and the thing she had been building there, which was a boatyard, which I do not think she ever told another living soul. We talked about my mother's hands at the end. And in 4 years, she did not touch me once, and I did not touch her once, and both of us knew exactly what was happening. And neither of us said a single word about it, because she was the Alpha of Coldharbour, and I kept the ledger. And the ledger is very clear about what an Alpha of Coldharbour is for. An Alpha of Coldharbour is for the Alliance. Page 406, second hand. And I had copied it out myself at 19 for a scribing exercise, which is a detail I have found difficult to forgive. The Renard proposal came in the November I turned 24. Ylva Renard was 31 and clever and genuinely unfairly likable. And she came up the valley with 40 riders and a marriage contract and an offer of the northern water rights that Coldharbour had been bleeding over for a generation. She shook my hand in the courtyard. She asked me what I did. When I told her, she said, "Then you're the only one here I actually need to be polite to," and laughed and meant it, and I hated how much I did not hate her. The elders convened for 9 days. On the 9th day, Elder Brita Kolarov, who is Vesna's grandmother and was then 75, came to the record room alone and asked me to bring out the marriage precedents. I brought them out. She read for 2 hours. Then she closed the book, and she looked at me, really looked, the way the very old look at you when they have stopped bothering with the polite middle distance. And she said, "Child, how long?" I said, "How long what, Elder?" And she said, "Don't." I did not answer her. She did not ask again. She stood up and she put her hand flat on the ledger the way you touch a horse before you walk behind it. And she said, "You should not be here when it is announced. I want to be fair to Vesna, and this is the part where being fair costs me something." She came to me first. 3 nights before the announcement, she came to the record room, and she did not sit on the arm of the chair. She stood by the window with her back to me for a long time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was the same voice she used for land disputes, which is how I knew what it was going to be. She said, "I am going to sign the Renard contract." I said, "I know." She said, "Sorcha." And I said, "Alpha. The third-hand clause on page 411 requires the ledger keeper to witness the signing. I'll be there." She turned around then. I have thought about her face in that moment more than I have thought about almost anything else in my life, and I still cannot tell you what was in it. And I have had a very long time to work it out. She said, "That isn't what I came to say." And I said, "I know that too." And I did not let her say it, because if she had said it, I would not have been able to leave. And I had already decided to leave. I left Coldharbour 11 days later, in the dark, with the ledger locked in its case on the record room table where it belonged, and my mother's brass clasp in my coat pocket where it did not. I told Bess Corrigan, who runs the Long Hall Kitchens and has run them since before I was born, and who has never in 40 years told anyone anything she was not supposed to. I told nobody else. I did not know yet that I was carrying something that would make the leaving mean something entirely different. I found out in a rented room above a chandler's shop in Margate, 6 weeks later, with frost on the inside of the window. I sat on the edge of a bed that was not mine in a town where I knew one person, and I did the arithmetic 4 times, and each time it came out the same. And each time the room got a little quieter. There had been one night. I have not described it, and I am not going to, except to say that it happened in the 11th month of the 4th year, that neither of us planned it, that neither of us said one word about it afterwards, and that it was the only time in 4 years either of us broke the perimeter we had built. One night. And now, apparently, arithmetic. Wynn was born in Margate in the last week of August, in a room above a chandler's shop, with Bess Corrigan's sister holding one of my hands and a midwife I had paid in copied documents holding the other. She came out furious. I want that on the record because it is the truest thing about her. She came out furious, and she has stayed that way. And the first sound she ever made was not a cry but a complaint. And the woman who delivered her laughed out loud and said, "Well, that one's an Alpha's," and then caught herself and looked at me, and I said, "Yes." And that was the entire conversation we ever had about it. I did not tell Vesna. I am going to sit with that sentence rather than defend it, because I have spent 3 years failing to defend it, and I would rather be honest with you than clever. Here is what I told myself. If I told her, she would come. That was not in doubt. Vesna Kolarov would have come up that valley in whatever weather and taken us both back to Coldharbour, and the Renard contract would have burned, and the northern water would have stayed in Renard hands. And in 11 years, there would have been a war over it. And the ledger has 40 pages on what happens to Coldharbour Omegas in a war over water. I had read all 40. So I told myself I was protecting a pact. That was true. It was also not the reason. The reason was that she had stood at that window with her back to me and said, I am going to sign the Renard contract. And I had decided in that moment that I would never in my life be a thing that somebody chose second. Pride is not a virtue. It is a load-bearing wall. You do not notice you built your whole house on it until you try to take it out. Margate was 3 years of small work and small rooms. I copied documents. I read wills for people who could not read them and could not afford someone who could. I learned that the second hand, the one nobody teaches, turns up in insurance contracts more often than in pack records, and that men who write insurance contracts in an archaic hand are usually hiding something in the fourth clause. I got quite good at finding the fourth clause. Wynn grew. She learned to walk at 10 months, which was too early, and she learned to run at 11, which was a catastrophe. She had my mother's amber eyes, and she had, from the very beginning and from nowhere I could account for, an absolutely unshakable conviction that she was in charge of every room she entered. At 2, she started pressing her thumb to the base of her own throat when she was thinking. I saw her do it in the chandler's window one afternoon. Reflected, a small serious person working something out with her thumb against her collarbone. And I had to sit down on the step outside and stay there for a while. The summons came in the second week of December. It came properly, in the pack's hand, sealed, carried by a rider who had ridden 2 days and looked it. I read it standing in the door with Wynn on my hip and Flower on my sleeve. Coldharbour was in a treaty dispute with the Renard pack over the northern water. The dispute turned on a clause written in 1691 in the third hand, and the Renards had produced a copy that said one thing. And Coldharbour's ledger said, possibly, another. And there were now precisely 2 people alive who could read the original well enough to swear to it in front of a council. One of them was 91 years old and had lost his sight. The other one was standing in a doorway in Margate with Flower on her sleeve. The letter did not come from Vesna. It came from Elder Brita Kolarov. And it was 4 lines long, and the last line said, "Bring whatever you must bring. Nobody will ask." I read that line 11 times. I want to tell you I agonized over it. I didn't. I was packed in 2 hours. I have thought about why since, and the honest answer is not noble. It was not duty, and it was not water rights. It was that somewhere under 3 years of small rooms I had been waiting, without permission, without hope, in a way I would have denied under oath, for a reason to be in the same room as her again. The reason arrived. I took it. Wynn wore her red coat. We came up the valley on the 18th of December in the back of a wool cart, and Coldharbour came out of the snow the way it always does, all at once. The long hall's roof first, and then the walls, and then the smoke. And Wynn stood up in the cart and pointed and said, "House!" I said, "Yes, that one." She said, "Big." I said, "You have no idea." Bess Corrigan met us at the kitchen door and did not say a single word. She took Wynn out of my arms. She looked at her for about 4 seconds, and then her face did something complicated, and she turned away and put her down and said, in a completely level voice, "There's soup." That was it. That was the whole reunion. Then she said, without turning round, "Does she know?" And I said, "No." And Bess said, "Then you'd better keep that one out of the hall, hadn't you?"
If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so the next one can find you. Stay close.
I want to describe the record room because I had not let myself think about it for 3 years. And then I was standing in it. Nothing had been moved. That is the part I was not ready for. The reading chair was where it had been. The ink cabinet was where it had been. The ledger was in its case on the table with the brass fittings polished, which meant someone had been polishing them weekly for 3 years. For a book nobody in the building could read. There was a second chair by the fire that had not been there before. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on, and I looked at that chair for a long time. She came at the end of the second day. I heard her in the corridor, and I had time, 4 seconds, 5, to arrange my face, and I did arrange it, and then she came through the door, and I discovered that I had arranged the wrong face entirely. Vesna Kolarov at 34. The auburn pulled back so hard it looked like a decision. Gray at one temple that had not been there. The same absolute economy of movement. The same way of coming into a room as though she had already been in it and had simply become visible. She stopped just inside the door. She said, "Sorcha," and I said, "Alpha," and something went across her face and was gone. We worked for 6 days. That is the part I did not expect, and it is the part that undid me. We worked. She came every evening, and she sat on the arm of the chair, not the new one by the fire, the old one, the same arm. And I read her 1691 in the third hand, clause by clause, and she asked exactly the right questions, and neither of us said one word about anything. 6 days, 411 pages. On the 4th evening, she brought 2 cups of the black tea from the kitchen and put one down beside me without comment, which she had done perhaps 200 times in 4 years and had not done in 3. And I looked at it sitting there on the table next to the inkwell, and I had to go and check something in a cabinet for a minute. On the 5th evening, she said, "Where did you go?" I said, "Margate." She said, 3 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't write." And I said, "No, Alpha." And I turned the page, and after a moment she let me. On the 6th evening, she said, "There was something I was going to say to you before." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Do you want to hear it now?" And that right there was the moment. And I want to be very clear that I understood it was the moment, and I want to be very clear about what I did with it. I said, "The council convenes on the 21st, Alpha. Let's get through the 21st. The winter feast is on the 20th. It is not optional. It has not been optional since 1642. Every soul in Coldharbour eats in the long hall on the 20th of December, and the Alpha sits at the high table, and the ledger is brought out and laid open at the year's page, and the ledger keeper stands at the foot of the table and reads the year's record aloud. Births, bondings, deaths, debts. I had read it aloud 4 times in my life. I knew exactly where I would stand. What I did not know was that Alpha Renard would be there. The Renards came up the valley on the morning of the 20th, which is either a courtesy or a maneuver depending on who you ask. And by noon there were 40 extra horses in the yard, and Ruve the stable boy had gone the particular gray color of a 19-year-old who has just realized how much work the next 4 days are going to be. Alpha Renard came into the record room at 3. She had not changed. She looked at the ledger, and she looked at me, and she said, "So they got you back. Good. I told them it was that, or bring me a man who can't see." I said, "Alpha Renard." She said, "Ilva. God. We're going to be arguing about a clause in front of 9 elders in 30 hours. You can use my name." And then she said, quite lightly, not looking at me, "You left the week the contract was announced." I said, "I did." And she said, and picked up an inkwell and put it down again and said, "For what it's worth. It was never signed." I did not move. I said, "The contract." She said, "It was never signed. 3 years on the table, initialed on both sides, never signed. Her elders have been screaming about it since the spring." She turned the inkwell around once more. "I stopped taking it personally about 18 months ago. It isn't about me." And then she looked up and she said, with real curiosity and absolutely no cruelty at all, "Do you know I've never worked out what it is about? I got through the next 4 hours by doing things with my hands. I laid out the year's page. I mixed ink I did not need. I checked the brass clasp of the ledger 11 times. Bess sent up a plate at 6, and I did not eat it. At 7, she sent up Ruve with a message, which was, "Bess says the small one is in the kitchen, and the small one is fine, and the small one is currently eating an entire loaf." I said, "Thank you. He said, she's yours, isn't she? I said, yes. And he said, she's got the... and then stopped and went red and did the thing with his thumb against his own throat without knowing he was doing it, and then went even redder and left. 19-year-olds are not the problem. 19-year-olds are never the problem. The problem is that a 19-year-old had noticed in 4 seconds what 400 people were going to notice in about 4 hours. The long hall on the 20th of December, 200 candles and 4 iron chandeliers, and the wolf crest banners down the whole length of it, and the snow coming so hard against the high windows that the glass had gone white and blind, and 400 people at the longboards with their coats still on because the doors keep opening. The high table across the top, Vesna in the center in dark green, Elder Brita on her right, Ilva Renard on her left, which is where you put a guest you are negotiating with, and which everyone in that room could read as easily as I read the third hand. And at the foot of the table on the flagstones, in a borrowed gray dress with the ledger open in her arms, I read the year, 11 births, I read every name, 4 bondings, 2 deaths, one of them a boy of 22 who had gone through the ice in February, and whose mother was sitting 11 feet from me. And I read his name the way the ledger requires, which is slowly, and I did not look up. 9 debts entered, 3 discharged, and then the treaty entries, which is where the room woke up, because everybody in Coldharbour knew what was happening on the 21st. I closed the ledger. I should have walked away then. The reading is the whole of the ledger keeper's part in the winter feast. 4 times in my life I have read the year and closed the book, and gone back to stand by the wall with the hall staff. And that is the entire tradition. But Ilva Renard's second, a broad, pleasant man called Aldous, leaned back on the bench with his cup and said, genuinely, without malice, genuinely just making conversation across a hall on a feast night, Alpha Kolarov. Who is she then? Your girl reads that book better than my clerks read their own hands. I have replayed the next 4 seconds approximately 9,000 times. 400 people, 200 candles, snow on the glass. And Vesna Kolarov, who could have said, she keeps our records and she is the reason your pack is going to lose tomorrow, or she is Coldharbour's ledger keeper, as her mother was, or literally anything at all. Vesna Kolarov pressed her thumb to the old bite scar at the base of her own throat, and she said, she keeps the ledger. That is all she keeps. I want to tell you what a room of 400 people sounds like when it decides not to react. It sounds like nothing. That is the whole horror of it. Nobody gasped. Nobody laughed. 400 people picked up their cups at the same time and looked at the middle distance, and the only sound in the long hall was the snow, and I stood on the flagstones holding 1,100 pages of everybody's history, and understood that I had just been filed. Elder Brita closed her eyes. Ilva Renard put her cup down very slowly, and looked at Vesna the way you look at someone who has just made a mistake you cannot help them with, and I said, Alpha, and inclined my head exactly as far as a records keeper inclines it, and turned to go. And the door at the kitchen end of the hall opened. I want to be precise about the order of things, because the order is what matters. First there was the door. Then there was Bess Corrigan's voice, which nobody in that hall had ever heard raised, saying, Wynn, Wynn, love, and being too late, because you cannot catch a 3-year-old who has decided something, and Wynn had decided something. Then there was a small person in a red coat, coming up the whole length of the long hall between 400 people, at a determined and slightly unstable run, with a heel of bread still in one fist. She was making for me. Obviously, she was making for me. She had been in a hot kitchen for 6 hours, and she wanted her mother, and I was the only thing in that room she recognized, and she came at me like a thrown stone. And then, 11 feet away, she stopped. She had seen the high table. I watched my daughter stop dead on the flagstones of the long hall and look up at the woman in dark green at the center of the high table. She looked at her for a long time, long enough for 400 people to turn their heads, long enough for me to say her name once, quietly, and for her to completely ignore it. And then Wynn dropped the bread, and she put out both arms toward the high table, the way she does, the way she has done since she could stand, the absolutely non-negotiable demand of a small person who has decided you are going to pick her up. And she said, into the total silence of that hall, "Mama, 400 people, 200 candles, and a 3-year-old standing on the flagstones with her arms out, saying it again, louder, because the first time had not worked. Mama!" She was not looking at me. That is the thing. That is the thing I could not have arranged, could not have prevented, and will never stop thinking about. My daughter had never seen a picture of Vesna Kolarov. I did not own one. I had never spoken her name in that child's hearing, not once, not sleeping, not ever. She had walked into a hall of 400 strangers, looked at the high table, and known. Vesna Kolarov did not move. I have seen that woman hold a line against 9 elders. I have seen her stand at her father's grave in horizontal rain for 40 minutes without shifting her weight. I have never, before or since, seen her look the way she looked on the 20th of December, with her thumb still at her own throat, and a 3-year-old standing 11 feet away with both arms out. The cup went out of her hand. It did not smash. It rolled off the table and went along the flags and stopped against my foot. And I remember that, and I remember the sound of it perfectly. And it was the only sound in that entire hall for what I am told was 4 seconds, and what I would have sworn under oath was a year. Then Elder Brita Kolarov, 78 years old, stood up at the high table, and in a voice that carried the whole length of the long hall, the old woman said, "Well, somebody had better pick that child up." Vesna came down off the dais. She did not go around the end of the high table, which is the way the Alpha of Coldharbour leaves the high table, and has been for 4 centuries. She put one hand flat on the boards and went over it in front of 400 people and 9 elders and the whole Renard delegation. And she came down the 3 steps, and she crossed the flagstones, and she went down on one knee in a dark green coat in front of a 3-year-old in a red one. She did not touch her. I want that understood because it was the only thing she got right that night. And she got it right without thinking, which is how I know it was true. She went down to Wynn's height, and she put her hands on her own knees, and she stayed there. And Wynn, who is not a patient child, made an extremely irritated noise and closed the last 2 feet herself and put both hands flat on Vesna Kolarov's face. That is when the hall made a sound, not a cheer. Coldharbour does not cheer. It was lower than that, and it came from everywhere at once, and it went on for some time, and under it I could hear Bess Corrigan, 20 feet behind me, saying "oh" over and over into her apron. Ilva Renard stood up at the high table. She looked down the length of the hall at the 2 of them on the flagstones for a moment. Then she picked up her cup, and she raised it about 2 inches. To me, not to Vesna, to me standing there holding the ledger. And she drank and sat back down. I have never in my life been so grateful to a woman I had spent 3 years quietly resenting. I got Wynn out through the kitchen door. I want to say I did something dignified. I did not. I crossed 11 feet of flagstone in a borrowed dress, and I picked my daughter up off the floor, and I said, "We're going." And Wynn said, "No," with tremendous force, and I said, "Yes," and carried her out past 400 people while she twisted in my arms, trying to keep her eyes on the woman kneeling on the flags. At the kitchen door, she got a hand free and reached back over my shoulder. I did not turn around to see whether Vesna was still on her knees. I have regretted that for a long time. She came to the record room at midnight. I had known she would, and I had spent 2 hours deciding what I was going to say, and I had settled on something clean and short that would let both of us keep our footing. She came in and shut the door and stood with her back against it, and she said, 3 years. And everything I had prepared went out of my head. 3 years, she said again. She's 3. I said, she's 3 in August. Sorcha. She was born on the 28th of August at about 4 in the morning in a room above a chandler's shop in Margate. and she came out furious, and she has not stopped. I heard my own voice do something on the word furious, and I stopped talking. Vesna Kolarov came off the door. She crossed to the table and put both hands on it, on either side of the closed ledger, and stood there with her head down for a while. And when she spoke, it was not the land dispute voice. I had heard that voice exactly once before, at her father's grave, and I had promised myself I would never be the reason for it. She said, "You let me stand up in front of my own pack and say that." And I said, "You said it. I didn't put it in your mouth." "No." She looked up. "No, I did that. That one is mine, and I will carry it, and I am not asking you to make it smaller." Her thumb went to her throat and she caught it and put her hand flat on the table instead. "But you let me stand there not knowing. For 6 days you sat in this room and read me 1691, and you let me not know." I said, "If I had told you 3 years ago, you would have come." She said, "Yes. You'd have burned the Renard contract." "Yes. And in 11 years, there'd have been a war over the Northern Water, and I have read the 40 pages of this book about what happens to Coldharbour Omegas in a war over water, and you have not." And Vesna Kolarov said, very quietly, "You don't get to make that trade on your own." I said, "Somebody had to." And she said, "No, somebody had to be asked." We stood there on opposite sides of a table with 1,100 pages of other people's history between us. And then she said the thing that took the floor out. She said, "I never signed it." I said, "I know Ilva told me. Do you know why?" "I've been trying not to think about why for 3 years, Alpha." And she said, "Stop calling me that in this room." I did not say anything. She said, "There was something I was going to say to you before. You wouldn't let me say it. You didn't let me say it on the 5th evening either, and you didn't let me say it on the 6th. I said, "No." "Why?" And I told her the truth, which I had not planned to do, and which came out badly and fast and in the wrong order. I said, "Because you were going to say it while there was a contract on your table with somebody else's name initialed on it, and I would have believed you. And then I would have spent the rest of my life being the thing you kept in a room off the record hall, and I would have let you. That's the part I couldn't live with. Not that you'd do it, that I'd let you." The fire had gone down to a red bed. She stood there for a long moment. Then she said, "Get the council through tomorrow." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "And then, Sorcha, you are going to sit still and let me finish a sentence." She stopped at the door. She said without turning round, "Is she well? Has she been well?" And I said, "She's never been sick a day. She walks like you. She's rude to strangers." And Vesna said, "Good," in a completely wrecked voice, and went out. She did not go far. I found that out at about 2 in the morning, when Wynn woke the way she does, instantly, at full volume, with no transition whatsoever. And I came out of the small room off the record hall with her on my shoulder, and found the Alpha of Coldharbour sitting on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall opposite my door. She got up fast. She said, "I wasn't..." And Wynn, who does not care about anybody's dignity, stopped mid-howl, looked at her over my shoulder, and said, with enormous indignation, I want to describe what happened to Vesna Kolarov's face. I can't. I have 4 hands, and 4 centuries of vocabulary in that room, and none of it is any use. She said, "Yes." And Wynn said, "Up," and put both arms out. And there was no possible answer to that. And there had not been one for 400 years. She held my daughter in a corridor at 2 in the morning for about 40 minutes, standing, not moving, in the particular locked posture of a person who has been handed something and has not yet worked out how not to break it. Wynn went back to sleep in 11 minutes. Vesna did not put her down. At some point, I went and got the chair from the record room and put it behind her, and she sat down in it without a word. And I sat on the floor with my back against my own door, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "What does she like?" And I said, "Bread. Horses, in theory. Being carried, which she does not need. Being told no, which she treats as an opening position. What is she frightened of? Nothing. "It's a problem." She thought about that. She said, "And what does she call you?" And I said, "Mama." And Vesna Kolarov said, "Yes," and then did not say anything else for quite a while. And I looked at the far wall and let her not say it. At about 3, she said, "I would like to be told the things I missed. Not tell me, not a command." She had been Alpha of Coldharbour for 11 years, and she asked me for it like a person at a door. So I told her. I told her about the 28th of August and the chandler's shop. I told her about 10 months and walking and 11 months and running. I told her about the red coat, which had come off a market stall in Margate and had been fought for. I told her about the winter Wynn had a cough for 9 days, and I had counted her breaths at night with the same hands I count folio pages with. And I told her about the thumb. I told her about standing outside a chandler's window in Margate, watching a 2-year-old press her thumb to the base of her own throat while she worked something out, and having to sit down on the step. Vesna Kolarov did not say anything at all, but at some point in the next minute, she moved her free hand, slowly, the way you do when you do not want to wake someone, and put her thumb against the old bite scar at the base of her own throat and left it there. And I put my head back against my own door and closed my eyes and let 3 years go through me all at once on the floor of a corridor at 3 in the morning. At about 4, she said, "I have a council in 5 hours. I said, "You do." She said, "I am not going to be able to think about water." And I said, "You won't have to. That's what I'm for." She looked at me over the top of my sleeping daughter's head. She said, "That is not what you're for." Bess Corrigan found the 3 of us at 6:30 when she came up with the kitchen fires lit and the whole hall to feed and 40 Renard horses in the yard. The Alpha of Coldharbour was asleep in a record room chair in yesterday's coat with a 3-year-old on her chest, and the ledger keeper was asleep on the floor against a door. And Bess Corrigan stood in that corridor for a moment, and then went away again and came back 11 minutes later with 2 cups of black tea and a blanket, and put them down and said nothing to anybody about it ever. She did tell the entire kitchen, obviously. I found that out in about April. The council convened at 9 on the 21st in the long hall with the boards cleared and the banners still up and the snow still coming. 9 elders of Coldharbour, 6 of Renard, Ilva at one table and Vesna at the other, and the ledger open on a stand between them, and me beside it, because a clause in the third hand cannot be read from a copy, and everybody in that room knew it. The dispute was this. In 1691, Coldharbour and Renard had divided the northern water. The Renard copy said the division was by the year, which would mean the water alternated, which would mean Renard had been owed half of everything Coldharbour had taken out of it for 334 years. The number, when their clerk read it out, made a sound go round the Coldharbour benches. Ilva Renard's clerk was good. He was thorough, and he was fair, and he read his copy carefully, and he was, I want to be clear, entirely honest. The Renard copy did say, by the year. He had not forged anything. He had simply been handed a 19th century transcription of a 17th century document and had done what any reasonable person does, which is trust it. I let him finish. Then Elder Breda said, "Ledger keeper." And I put my hand flat on page 411. And I said, "Elders, the transcription is wrong, and I can show you where the copyist made the mistake. And I can show you that he made the same mistake twice more in the same folio. Here is what the copyist did in 1814 in a warm room at the end of a long folio. The third hand writes anno by the year, and arno by the channel, the arm of the water, with a difference of 1 stroke. 1. The upstroke on the second letter closes in anno and stays open in arno, and by the second half of the 17th century, the scribes were writing so fast that the difference is about the width of a hair. A copyist working from the original at speed in 1814, with no reason on earth to think it mattered, reads anno. He read it 3 times in that folio, and in the other 2 places, the sentence around it makes it obvious that he was wrong, because in one of them, the passage is about a mill, and a mill cannot be divided by the year, and in the other one, the same phrase is used of a bridge. I laid the original open, and the Renard clerk came round the stand and looked at it for a long time. Then he straightened up and said, To his own Alpha, in a completely flat voice, "He's right about the bridge, Alpha. It's the arm of the water. It's always been the arm of the water." Ylva Renard sat back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 334 years, and laughed, one short, disbelieving breath, and said, "We've been carrying a grudge about a letter." And Elder Brita Kolarov said, dry as flint, "Most packs do." It was over by 11. The Renards conceded the northern water, and Coldharbour conceded the mill rights at Ashford, which the Ledger had been quietly saying belonged to Renard since 1691, and which nobody on our side had ever bothered to look up. Ylva signed. Vesna signed. And that should have been the end of the 21st of December, and I was already closing the ledger, when Elder Brita said, "Keeper, don't shut it." She stood up, 78 years old, both hands on the table, in front of 9 elders of Coldharbour and 6 of Renard, and, by then, a long hall with rather more people standing at the back of it than the council had strictly invited. She said, "There is an unentered birth. I want to explain the law, because the law is the whole of what happens next. A pup born to a Coldharbour Omega must be entered in the ledger before its 4th year. That is not ceremony. It is standing. An unentered pup has no claim on packland, no place in the succession, no right to be buried in the ground at Coldharbour, and no protection from the council if anyone should ever decide to make an argument about it. The entry requires 2 names, the dam and the sire. And if the second name is not given, the keeper writes unnamed, and the pup is entered, and the pup is safe, and the pup is, for the rest of its life, in every record that matters, the child of one woman and a blank space." Elder Brita said, "Bring the child." And Bess Corrigan, who I would go to war for, said from the back of the hall, "She's already here, Elder," and came up the middle of the long hall with Wynn on her hip in the red coat. I stood at the stand with the pen in my hand. I have entered 11 births in my life. I know the form: date, hour, if known, dam, sire, witnesses, hand. I wrote the date. I wrote the hour. I wrote Sorcha Bell of Coldharbour. And then the pen was over the next line, and the long hall was completely silent, and I understood with total clarity that this was mine to do. Nobody could take it off me. The keeper writes the entry. If I wrote unnamed, it was written and it was final, and Vesna Kolarov would walk out of that hall in Alpha with a clean record and a treaty and no scandal at all, and my daughter would be a blank space, and I would have protected her one more time from a choice she never got to make. I had done it once already. I was extremely good at it. I looked up. Vesna was standing at her table with her hands at her sides, and I did the only thing I have ever done in my life that I am completely proud of. I did not write. I turned the ledger around on the stand so that page 412 faced the Coldharbour table, and I put the pen down on the open book, and I said, in a voice that carried the whole length of the long hall, "Alpha Kolarov. The entry requires a second name. I am not going to write it for you." 400 people, the snow still coming, and Vesna Kolarov came round the end of her table, round it this time properly, the way the Alpha of Coldharbour crosses a floor. And she came to the stand, and she picked up the pen. She did not look at the elders. She did not look at Ylva Renard, who deserved to be looked at, and who was watching with an expression I still think about. She looked at me, and she said loudly enough for the back of the hall, "Ledger keeper. Read back what you have." I read it back. Entered the 21st of December. Born the 28th of August, about the 4th hour. Dam, Sorcha Bell of Coldharbour. And Vesna said, "Good." And she wrote in her own hand in the ledger, in front of 400 people, "Sire, Vesna Kolarov, Alpha of Coldharbour, named freely. Entered late by my fault and no others. She was not finished." She put the pen down and she turned around, and she faced the long hall, and she said, "Yesterday, at this table, a man asked me who she was, and I said she keeps the ledger, and that is all she keeps." She let that sit. That was a lie told by a coward in her own hall, and every one of you heard it, so every one of you is going to hear this. She keeps the ledger. said Vesna Kolarov. She keeps my daughter. She kept my pack out of a war for 3 years by carrying a thing alone that I should have been carrying with her. And if she will have me, which she has no reason on earth to do, she keeps me. She looked back at me. That is what she keeps. I would like to tell you that I said something. I did not. I stood at the stand with both hands flat on page 412, and I looked at a 3-year-old on Bess Corrigan's hip in a red coat, and the long hall of Coldharbour made that low sound again, the one that comes from everywhere at once. And it went on for a very long time. Elder Brita sat down. She said, to nobody, in the voice of a woman closing a file she has been holding open for 3 years. Well, finally, Ilva Renard left on the 22nd. She came to the record room to say goodbye, which she did not have to do. And she looked at the ledger and she said, 334 years and a letter. I'm going to be telling that story until I die. Then she said, for what it's worth, Keeper, she never once said your name. In 3 years. Not once. I should have worked it out from that. I said, why? And Ilva Renard said, because people say the names of things they've lost. They don't say the names of things they're still hoping about. I did not sit still and let her finish a sentence on the 22nd, because Wynn had a cold, and I did not on the 23rd, because the elders wanted the treaty fair copied in all 4 hands, and I did not on the 24th, because I was frightened. I want to be honest about that. It was not scheduling. It was fear. 3 years of building a life around a locked door, and the door was open. And I stood in the record room fair copying a treaty I could have done in my sleep and not going through it. She waited. That is the part I did not expect and will not get over. Vesna Kolarov, who has never in her life waited for anything, waited 4 days. She came at the end of each one and sat on the arm of the reading chair and asked about the fair copy and did not ask about anything else, and left. On the 4th evening, Wynn fell asleep on the hearthrug in the record room with her boots on. Vesna looked at her for a while. Then she said, she sleeps like you. She's got one arm over her face. And I said, you've watched me sleep exactly once, Alpha. And she said, once was sufficient. I let her finish the sentence on the 28th of December, at about 11 at night, in the record room, with the fire down to a red bed and a 3-year-old asleep on the hearthrug with her boots on. I did it badly. I put down the pen in the middle of a word. The treaty fair copy has a broken letter on the 4th page, and the elders have never let me forget it. And I said, say it. Say it now before I find something else to copy. Vesna Kolarov did not get up off the arm of the chair. She said, 4 years ago you had ink on your face, and I came out of that room and stood in the corridor for 10 minutes because I could not work out what had just happened to me. I said, you said I had ink on my face. I am aware of what I said. A pause. It was the best I could do. She said, I have loved you since the 2nd winter and I have known it since the 3rd. And I did not say it because I had a pack that had just buried a bad alpha and 40 pages of law about what an alpha of Coldharbour is for. And then the Renards came, and I put a contract on the table because it was the thing that saved the water, and I could not think of another one. And I initialed it, and I could not sign it. For 3 years, she looked at the fire. I thought you had gone because I had shamed you. I have thought that every day for 3 years. There is not a room in this house I have not thought it in. I said, Vesna. She looked up. I had not used her name in 4 years. I said, I went because I was pregnant and too proud to be a second choice. And I have been telling myself it was about water rights, and it was about water rights for approximately 11% of it. And Vesna Kolarov said, 11. And I said, I keep records. She laughed. I want that in here, because I do not think 400 people at Coldharbour have ever heard it, and I have heard it perhaps 9 times in my life. It is not a big sound. It goes out of her like something escaping. Then she came off the arm of the chair and crossed the room and stopped in front of me, and did not touch me and said, ask me for something. I said, what? Anything. One thing. Out loud. I have watched you not ask for anything for 4 years, and I would like to hear what it sounds like. I said stay. She stayed. I'm not going to give you that winter in detail, partly because the ledger is not a place for it, and partly because it is mine. What I will tell you is the shape of it. She moved the second chair, the one by the fire that had appeared in 3 years I was not there, round to the other side of the table, so that there were 2 working places instead of 1, and she did not say anything about it, and neither did I. She learned the second hand, badly. She is genuinely bad at it, and it is the only thing I have ever seen her be bad at, and it delights me beyond all reason. Wynn discovered the record room ladder in January and had to be removed from the top of it 11 times in one afternoon. And on a night at the end of that month, with the snow finally stopped and the valley absolutely silent, Vesna Kolarov asked me a question with her mouth against the side of my throat, and I said yes. And she asked me again in the morning when I was in a position to think about it properly, which is the single most Vesna thing she has ever done. And I said yes again. The mark healed by the spring. It is not a large one. It sits where hers does, which is not an accident. The pack adjusted in about 9 days. I had braced for a year. I had braced for the thing that happens to omegas in packs when they get above themselves. And I had made a plan for it. And I did not need the plan. And I have thought a lot about why. It is because of Elder Breda. The morning after the council, she came into the long hall for breakfast, and she sat down not at the high table, but at the second board, next to Bess Corrigan, with Wynn between them, and she stayed there for the entire meal, and she did that every morning for 11 days. Nobody in Coldharbour said one word about my daughter's standing after the 3rd day. Not one. Bess Corrigan cried exactly once, in April, over nothing at all, a spilled pan, and told everybody it was the onions. And there were no onions. Ruv, who is now 20 and runs the stable, taught Wynn to sit a pony in June and has never fully recovered from the responsibility. And Ilva Renard sent in March, with no note attached, a barrel of the good Renard cider and a child's saddle. The ledger has an entry for the 21st of December that is not in my hand. Every keeper of Coldharbour since 1642 has written every word of that book. 4 hands, 4 centuries, and then 11 lines in a 5th hand that is worse than all of them, made by a woman who holds a pen like a chisel. I have been asked twice whether I want to fair copy it into the proper hand. I have said no twice. That is nearly the end. There is one more thing. The winter feast came round again on the 20th of December. 200 candles, 4 iron chandeliers, the banners down the whole length of it, and the snow coming against the high windows exactly the way it had the year before. Because it always does. Because that is what the 20th of December is for. 400 people at the long boards with their coats still on, and at the foot of the high table, on the flagstones, in a gray dress that was mine this time, with the ledger open in my arms. Me. I read the year, 9 births. I read every name, 6 bondings, and I read one of them in the same flat voice I read the other 5, and 400 people let me. And somebody at the back made a noise into their cup that I chose not to hear. 1 death. Old Aldous' mother, in her sleep, in November. 11 debts entered, 9 discharged. And the treaty at Ashford, fair copied in all 4 hands, with a broken letter on the 4th page. I closed the ledger. And a Renard man at the second board, because the Renards come to the winter feast now, which is a sentence nobody in that valley could have written 2 years ago, leaned back with his cup and said, across the hall, in exactly the same pleasant, thoughtless, conversational way, Alpha Kolarov. Who is she then? The long hall went absolutely silent. 400 people put their cups down at the same time. I have never heard a room do that. Somewhere near the kitchen end, Bess Corrigan said something under her breath that I am not going to write in a book that lasts 400 years. Vesna Kolarov did not press her thumb to her throat. She put her hand flat on the boards and she stood up, and she looked down the length of her own hall, and she said, she keeps the ledger. She let it sit, just long enough, just exactly long enough that every soul in that room went back to the year before and stood in it with her. And then Vesna Kolarov said, and I keep her, and she keeps me. And the small tyrant asleep under this table on my coat keeps the pair of us. And one day she will keep all of you. So I would be careful. 400 people made that low sound. Under the high table, Wynn, 4 years old and thoroughly unconscious in a nest of dark green wool, did not stir. I stood on the flagstones with 1,100 pages of everybody's history in my arms and my mother's brass clasp under my thumb, and I let the light move. I let it move as much as it liked. There is a line in the third hand on page 11 written in 1642 by whoever it was that started this book, and I have read it perhaps 400 times and never once understood it until that night. Herein is set down what the pack will not carry alone. That is all a ledger is. That is all any of it is. I had spent 3 years and 11 months proving I could carry a thing by myself, and I had been very good at it. And it had cost my daughter a name and cost that woman 3 years of thinking she had shamed me into the snow. I do not do it anymore. I write it down. I hand her the pen, and she names it out loud in front of everybody.